Blender's texture painting system is powerful due in part to its ability to paint in 2D space through the UV image editor, as well as the ability to paint directly on a 3D model in 3D space. So first let's explore the 2D side of this, and note that I am still using the Cycles render engine, meaning that whichever image texture node is selected in the node editor, that is what will be visible on our 3D model in the 3D view. And now I'll just switch the node editor to be our UV image editor. And down here at the bottom, we have our editing context, which is currently set to view. If we click that, let's choose paint. And you'll see that now we have a circular icon, which is representative of our paintbrush. So if I click and start to drag across our texture, you can see that we're laying a paint stroke down that is updating in real time over here in the left 3D view. And so you can see that the texture painting system works seamlessly between 2D and 3D. And all of our paint options live in the toolbar, which we can enable with the T key, or we can click this plus button on the left side of our UV image editor. And at the very top, we have our brush selection, which is set to text draw. If we click on that, we get several options like a clone tool, a fill tool, in case we want to fill our entire canvas with a color, which obeys this fill threshold. So if we turn that up to 1, you'll see that it pretty much fills everything except for some of these crosses. So anyway, that's the fill brush. We have a mask brush, smear, soften, and then text draw. And below that, for brushes that use a color like fill and text draw, we have a color wheel for selecting a color, 2 slots for a primary color and then also a secondary color, which we can switch back and forth with this icon. And then below that, we have our radius, which defines how big our brush is. We can also adjust that by hitting the F key in our window and then dragging left or right to increase or decrease the size. Next is the strength of our brush. The lower strength means that our color will be weaker, and the more that we click, it will start to build up its color. Setting that high all the way to 1 is full opacity for the color. Similar to the radius, we can also access that with a hotkey, Shift F in our window. Gives us the option to drag and decrease or increase the strength. And then next, for brushes that use color, we have a blend type option. If we click on that, we get a pretty large list of common blend modes that you might see in Photoshop or GIMP that will change the way the color we have selected interacts with the colors below it. For example, if we choose overlay, you can see that despite our selected color, that blend mode changes the behavior. And so there's several in here that can just adjust how the color operates, but a couple important ones are erase and add alpha. If I choose erase alpha, you see the color disappears. And as I click and drag, we're erasing our color information, revealing the checker in the background. And this is not the checker from our UV grid that we selected when we created the image. This texture means alpha. As you can see, when I zoom into the image, the checker does not change size. And then alternatively, we have add alpha, which will add that color information back. So let's switch this back to the default mix type. And then below our blend type, we have accumulate, alpha, and use gradient. I'll just leave these at the defaults, maybe cover them in a later lesson. Below that, we have the color palette option. If I click new, you'll see that we have a plus and minus button up here above our 2 color slots. And now if I click the plus button, we have added the first entry of a palette based on this color on the left, our primary color slot. And then we can start to build up a palette, just selecting different colors, hitting the plus button, in case these are standard colors that we would want to use over and over again. And we can even name this, in case we want to have multiple palettes. And then below that, we have 2 texture options, or 2 texture drop downs in our settings that contain several options inside. And this gives us the ability to use an image texture as our paint color, which I will cover in a later lesson, both this texture and texture mask. Below that, we have paint stroke options, where we have different stroke methods. Space is the default. We can have drag dot, which allows us to click and then place a single click of the mouse. We also have anchored, which we can click and then drag the size. It's again a single dot, which may not seem particularly useful with solid colors, but it's really good for the texture option. But also for the stroke method, we have a line option, which is really useful for drawing perfectly straight lines. And we also have a curve stroke method, which by control and clicking, right click in my case, since I use left click select. And if I click once, it will create a hard angle. But if I click and drag, it will give me the option to pull out a Bezier handle to smooth out our curve. And then when I hit enter, it will paint a stroke along that curve. And then finally, we have our paint curve options, which define how hard or soft the brush is, or the pattern of the brush. Where the default has our brush pretty soft on the edges, though I think I'm still using curve. Let's go back to space as a stroke method. And when I paint a stroke, you can see that it's soft on the edges. We can go through these presets that give us different effects. This one's a little harder on the edges. And then this guy on the far right is the hardest that our brush can be, which if we zoom in, it's actually quite pixelated. But also you have complete control over a custom curve. So if we do something like this, you'll see that our brush becomes a target of sorts. And that's the essentials of 2D painting in the UV image editor. Next, we'll take a look at 3D painting.